I'm Catherine Clarice with AECOM. I am an engineer and I've worked in brownfield redevelopment and municipal economic development for the cities of Cleveland and Buffalo, New York for my entire 20+ year career. Brownfields are my passion, and so I'm excited to bring the experience of AECOM and my own personal experience here today to share with you. I focus mainly on brownfield funding for environmental assessment and remediation. I've won more than $50 million in state and federal brownfield funding. I am an environmental consultant. We will talk today about how and when your environmental consultant can assist you throughout the brownfield redevelopment process. It's my hope that you will find your consultant to be a helpful member of your team who can guide you through technical and regulatory aspects. I heard a quote today by Seth Godin, an author, who talks about how sometimes growth can feel like you're stumbling in the dark and assume that everyone around you has already got it figured out. But if you could glimpse into the other organizations, you'd see that they're stumbling a little bit too. And I had approached Sean about doing this presentation because I wondered if land banks felt like they were stumbling a little bit, having now been thrust into the brownfield marketplace. And so it's my hope that today's presentation will shed a little bit of light on this topic and help you feel a little more comfortable in your brownfield projects. Many thanks to the Ohio Land Bank Association and Sean for having me here today. It's part of AECOM's culture that we begin every meeting with a safety moment. Today's quick safety moment provides a few reminders on safe practices for winter driving. First, be prepared, give yourself additional time, and check to make sure your tires, wipers, and lights are in good working condition. Dress for the weather, ensure you have sufficient fuel and wiper fluid. Ensure you're using those headlights and wipers while driving, and adjust your ventilation system to maintain visibility. Give yourself additional space around other vehicles. Aim for slow, steady acceleration and soft early braking. Remember to steer into a skid until you regain control. If your travel isn't critical, wait for conditions to improve. A quick intro to AECOM. AECOM is a Fortune 500 company providing architectural and engineering consulting services, including construction management for various markets, including environmental, facilities, transportation, water, energy, and government. We have over 50,000 employees in 150 countries around the world. 7,500 of those are dedicated environmental staff working on assessment, remediation, redevelopment planning, grant funding and economics, environmental justice, and energy. We have several Ohio office locations in Cleveland, Akron, Columbus, Cincinnati. Right now, we currently employ 3 Ohio VAP certified professionals. AECOM has extensive experience working with clients to identify and prioritize brownfield sites, develop successful state and federal grant applications, and perform planning, assessment, and cleanup activities. Okay, commercial over. Today's webinar will focus on the brownfield redevelopment process and funding options for redeveloping these contaminated sites. Today's presentation is broken into 2 main parts. First, we'll do an overview of the brownfield redevelopment process. We'll define a brownfield and how to take a brownfield property from abandoned, vacant, idle, or underused to a new beneficial end use. We'll also briefly talk about several brownfield funding programs available to you. And I'll pause for questions before we move on to the second portion, which will be focused on how to apply for Ohio Brownfield Remediation Program funding. Happy to answer any questions you have today. You can ask questions via chat. You can also reach me afterwards if you have specific questions you'd like to discuss privately. I'd love to talk with you and help provide solutions. You'll find my contact info at the beginning and end of the presentation. So let's get into it. What is a brownfield? We're going to review the definition first, kind of level the playing field. So for everyone's edification, the Ohio BRP guidelines give the definition from House Bill 33 that says a brownfield is defined as abandoned, idled, or underused industrial, commercial, or institutional property where expansion or redevelopment is complicated by known or potential releases of hazardous substances or petroleum. So it's known or suspected to have contamination. You may begin the process and not find anything. That's a good thing. Current or historical property use, industrial, commercial. Commercial can include apartment buildings with 4+ units, and institutional. Examples of institutional here would be churches, schools, government-owned buildings. To clarify, we're not talking about single-family homes, but redevelopment end use can include residential or green space components. And as the definition states, the most common contamination is hazardous substances, which includes asbestos and lead paint or petroleum. So people ask me, how do I identify brownfields in my community? And my advice would be to start with your problem properties, your tax delinquencies. Do you have vacant buildings that are catching on fire, posing safety or security risks to the community? Do you have gap tooth properties, as I like to call them, those last remaining eyesore properties in an otherwise developed area? And if that doesn't bear any fruit, focus on your priority redevelopment areas. Those would look like commercial districts or downtowns, your main thoroughfares. Maybe you're a highway community and you have a highway interchange where you have a bunch of businesses, or industrial areas. And then once you've identified your brownfield sites, think about prioritizing them. So consider the property marketability, available funds for the project, and the environmental and community benefits. And when you get into it, it will start to emerge which of those is more significant for which property. And last on the slide, I'm often asked if there's a map to consult. So unless someone in your area has created a brownfield inventory already or mapped your local brownfield sites, which is usually unlikely, generally there's no public list or map that's going to show you where the unaddressed brownfield sites are in your community. So maps and lists that Ohio EPA or US EPA may have identify brownfield properties that usually have already been funded or at least have been entered into one of their programs already. So on this slide, we're going to talk about the brownfield redevelopment process. I want to give you a little overview of the process, but I don't want to lose you here. So I've added this little green phone icon in the upper right corner. This is your call your environmental professional icon. That is an indication that we're about to get into some technical material on the slides. And I appreciate there are those of you that want to know all the details, but for everybody else, I'm here to reassure you you're going to do just fine if you have a general understanding of these terms. And that's what I'm trying to give you on this slide. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed or confused by this information because especially on this slide, the reality is you will contract an environmental consultant to complete this work. I want you to have an understanding of these terms. So once you've identified and prioritized your brownfield site, your first step is to conduct a phase 1 environmental assessment. That's a review of current and historical property use. It's going to indicate if you need additional assessment to determine the presence of contamination. That usually includes a site walk and current photographs, so you need signed access to go onto the property if you don't own the property. And you may have heard it called a phase 1 environmental site assessment. Ohio VAP calls it a property assessment. So we're going to just call it a phase 1 or a phase 2 environmental assessment. If your phase 1 doesn't recommend phase 2, you skip to the end. You move right on to sale or redevelopment. If your phase 1 recommends additional investigation, then you conduct the phase 2 environmental assessment. Your environmental consultant will collect environmental samples, soil, groundwater, surface water, sediment, and/or air, and send those samples to a laboratory to be analyzed. Your environmental professional decides where to sample and what to analyze for based on the current or previous uses of the property. The lab results are then compared to VAP or other regulatory standards. If results exceed the standards, the phase 2 recommends cleanup. If the data doesn't exceed the standards, the phase 2 will not recommend cleanup. And again, you move straight to the sale or redevelopment of the property. As part of the phase 2, you can also conduct an asbestos survey, which would be sampling and analysis of potentially asbestos containing building materials. And from there, the phase 2 data is used to draft a cleanup plan or asbestos abatement plan and the cost estimate. The cost estimate is used to apply for remediation funding. It's how much you're asking for to complete the remediation. For the sake of our discussion today, the word remediation is going to be synonymous with cleanup. You can use them interchangeably. After you've received word that the funding is awarded, you'll execute your grant agreement, and then you'll conduct your cleanup and confirmation samples. And then when the remediation is complete, your property is ready for sale or redevelopment. So a few notes: you do not need to own the property, but you would need signed legal access with the property owner to begin your phase one. I'm aware that land banks receive certain liability exemptions, but I'm still going to encourage you to always conduct the appropriate phase one environmental assessment prior to taking title to a site that could be a potential brownfield. So that's anything commercial, industrial, or institutional, just to give you additional liability protection. Talking about other regulatory programs, that's going to be a recurring theme during today's presentation. Your environmental consultant will help you determine what regulatory program drivers you will have on your property. So again, in the second part of the presentation, I'll give you some introduction to the various regulatory programs, but I don't anticipate it's something you're going to need to know the ins and outs of on your own. And last, I want to point out that cleanup can include various aspects. So it obviously can include what we call active remediation, soil and groundwater treatment, soil excavation and disposal, or in situ remediation where the contamination is treated in place. But it can also include engineering controls, ventilation of new buildings, soil capping where a layer of soil is added on top, or paving, and also creative redevelopment design or placement of features such as buildings and parking lots. Last, cleanup can also include institutional controls, which is restricting the future land use of the property. Most commonly, that's restricted to exclude future residential use. And that gets documented in a deed restriction that transfers with the property deed in perpetuity. So all three of these cleanup options are eligible remediation grant expenses. So when Sean and I were talking, he said he gets asked, which program should I apply for? And so I wanted to make you aware of the current offerings from the state of Ohio and USCPA as far as brownfield funding goes. Land banks are eligible to apply for all funds here. And the subsequent slides we'll dive into these a little bit. I want to note there are also loans and grants available through Jobs Ohio. I didn't list it on this slide. The Jobs Ohio Revitalization Fund funds assessment and remediation of brownfield sites. Those funds are typically used on higher profile projects with immediate development and job creation prospects, but I still want you to have Jobs Ohio in the back of your mind. And as a side note, all applications are competitive and funding for these is not guaranteed. So looking at Ohio's available programs, you're probably familiar with the site demolition and revitalization program, since those applications have already been accepted. Just to cover quickly, those are grant funds. They're specifically not for brownfields. They do not fund remediation, but they will fund asbestos abatement only projects or demolition. The BRP, which we'll go into more detail on, also grant funds, funding assessment and associated studies, remediation and associated costs, also funding asbestos only abatement projects. It can fund infrastructure, less than 20% of your total requests, and acquisition up to 10% of your request. And last and newest on the scene is the All Ohio Future Fund. They're referring to that as the AOFF. The rules for this program are currently undergoing approval. So everything I tell you here may change prior or until that approval is granted. So the Ohio budget allocated $750 million for this program. It will be funding applications on a rolling basis. And right now they're expecting this to be 20-year, 0% interest, partially forgivable loans. I understand there will be grant funds also available on a case-by-case basis. I do not know, currently it's unclear how much of the loan amount will be forgiven. But there's a 20-year payback on that. So it's funding infrastructure and other one-time costs to prepare sites for development. The examples they provide of infrastructure include roads, water and sewer, design engineering, demolition, wetland mitigation, utility gap connections or relocation, They specify the funds cannot be used for acquisition. Remediation may be eligible under this one-time flag for this program, but it's not their preference. They're hoping that remediation projects will use the BRP. I could see remediation coming in as an eligible cost here if you're requesting money for infrastructure, if the BRP is oversubscribed, or if the timelines, the cycle doesn't link up. There's a preference for, not a requirement. The requirement was removed. Initially, this had been discussed to be a mega site program, and they have removed that. So it's now a preference, not a requirement, for sites to be both publicly owned and more than 30 acres. If you have a smaller site, it can very much be eligible for the AOFF. They're looking for that geographic distribution of funds across the state, and they realize that not everyone may have a mega site. So this JCAR, Ohio's Joint Committee on Agency Rule Review, their approval is expected next month in February. And once that approval is received, ODOD will begin accepting what they call indication of interest, or IOIs. I think they're planning to put a format for the IOI on their website once that opens. And this program does expect an end user on the site within 5 years. Ohio also has a Brownfield Assistance Program through Ohio EPA, where they can help you with brownfield assessment and cleanup planning at no cost. They can do this through a grant they received through US EPA. So they're conducting phase 1, limited phase 2 assessments, tank surveys, asbestos, and lead paint surveys. But I want to make you aware that there's lead time on this program. So the time frames that I'm showing on the slide are relatively recent. They're from a presentation that Ohio EPA gave last month. So you need to account for this in your redevelopment timeline. If you don't have local funds available to conduct your phase 1 or phase 2 assessment, you can use this program. But you can request both from the BRP, but that's not ideal. If you have time, I'd encourage you to conduct your phase 1 with local funding or through this program, and then use the phase 1 fundings to develop an assessment application. But I'm getting ahead of myself now. The application for the TBA program is available online. And again, land banks and local governmental entities are eligible for this. I want to make you aware of the federal funding as well. We've had great success with this in Ohio. You may hear the US EPA Brownfield grants referred to as MARC grants, and that stands for Multi-Purpose Assessment, Revolving Loan, and Cleanup. Revolving loan applications were not accepted last year, though. So multi-purpose is the whole shebang. It includes planning, assessment, cleanup, brownfield inventory, and community engagement funds, but it's more so focused on a specific development area in your community. Last year's award ceiling for multi-purpose was $1 million. Assessment grants fund assessment, planning, inventory, community engagement, but can be on a larger scale in your county. So usually you'll include 1 to 3 example assessment sites that you're planning to assess, but the understanding is then you'll be able to use it on other sites within the area. Last year's awards ranged from $500,000 to $1.5 million. Again, revolving loan. I want to make it clear that revolving loan differs in that you would receive the funds to loan out for cleanup projects. So in essence, you would become the bank. Those awards are typically $1 million. I do not recommend, if you're new to the brownfield game, that you start out with being the entity that's loaning the funds. They want to see that seed money for future cleanup projects. And I'd suggest you start with an assessment or a cleanup grant if you're new to USCPA. And cleanup grants, last year it was $500,000 up to $5 million. They can be for 1 or more sites, but you're specifying the sites you're going to clean up in those applications. So this has been very well funded. Last year, there was $235 million available for these grants. That was an all-time high. We're 2 years into a 4-year allocation. There was $1.5 billion allocated from IIJA funding for federal brownfield money. So this amount is expected to stay the same or increase for the next 2 years. Guidelines for these applications usually come out in the fall, and then applications are due all at the same time. So 45 to 60 days after the guidelines are released, they're evaluated and scored all at the same time. But so start thinking about your application strategy and potential sites that you might want to look for USCPA funding. Start thinking about that now. And last on the slide, Brownfield Job Training Grants. They offer workforce development assistance to communities. They're usually offered separate from the MARC grants, typically due late summer, so a little earlier in the year than MARC grants, if you're looking to help enhance workforce in your community. Okay, so that's the end of the first part of the presentation. We're going to dive into the Brownfield Remediation Program application next, but I wanted to open it up, have a little dialogue if anyone had questions about the Brownfield process in general, or any of the information that I covered already. And Sean, let me know if anything came in on the chat.
Good on the chat, but everyone is able to unmute now. So if you do have a question, you can unmute to ask.
Okay, if you don't like being recorded, I understand. Feel free to reach out afterwards. I'd be happy to chat or answer other questions. Okay. So let's move into the Brownfield Remediation Program, the BRP for short. It's administered by the Ohio Department of Development, ODOD for short. And so there was a $350 million budget allocation for brownfield assessment and cleanup. They're splitting that into 2 fiscal years, $175 million in FY24 and in 25. In FY24, as you're probably aware of, there's the $1 million match-free county set-aside. Any requests above that $1 million amount kick on the 25% match requirement. And we'll talk more about the match requirement in a minute. Applications are being accepted now for FY24. The deadline is April 1st, 2024. So if you do not apply by April 1st, you will lose access to your $1 million set aside. There is no county set aside funds planned for FY25. The program runs on the state of Ohio's fiscal calendar year, which is July 1 through June 30th. That's important for you to know because you can't be reimbursed for costs incurred before July 4th, 2024, or before the date on which your grant agreement gets signed. And you may know the assessment limit is $300,000 for a request, and the remediation request limit is $10 million. And as a side note, foreclosed and forfeited properties are also eligible for this program. So you can submit a BRP assessment application that requests funding for either or both a phase 1 and phase 2 assessment, as well as hazardous material surveys, asbestos, lead paint, and underground tanks. You will need to consider if you want to request assessment funds from the BRP, or if you want to complete the assessments first using local funds or Ohio EPA TBA and then apply for remediation funding. So you can request funds to perform both the phase 1 and the phase 2 on a property at the same time, but you're going to work with your EP to figure out if that's strategic. It could be risky if it's a complicated site with no previous environmental reports. Recall that the phase 1 is used to plan the phase 2. So if you were to request funding for both assessments without any prior knowledge of the site, you could end up needing more phase 2 funding than you received. You can't modify your phase 2 funding request later once you complete your phase 1. So phase 1s are relatively inexpensive. If you're able to, I would say aim to conduct a phase 1 with local funding or through Ohio TBA. And if time is of the essence, perhaps you submit for both. This slide summarizes the aspects of a project that can be funded by a BRP remediation grant. You'll see the top 3 bullets are those various remediation options we discussed in the previous section. We won't review those again, but again, to reiterate, any of those technologies are eligible for remediation funding. Remediation grant can also fund take removals, asbestos abatement, demolition necessary for abatement or remediation. So you have to bring the building down to get to what's in the soil beneath it. That's what separates this demolition funded program from Ohio's site demo program. And lastly, confirmation sampling and environmental insurance. So a few do's and don'ts on the process. A reminder, you can submit for an asbestos only remediation grant. You work with your environmental professional to establish the budget, the basis for what funding you're requesting. And ODOD on their BRP website under grantee resources, they have a template for the budget table. They call it a PACE, a project assumption and cost estimate. So you can find that table on their website. The lead entity needs to create an Ohio ID to submit their applications. You'll need your federal employer identification number, your FEIN, and the land bank or the lead entity needs to be the one to submit the application online with their user ID. ODOD has said that other partners and consultants can't submit on their behalf. So you'll prioritize projects and submit your priority projects first. Just to clarify, the first project submitted will receive the $1 million set aside and not require a match. And lastly, they point out that Chrome is the preferred browser for application submission. Two don'ts: don't submit the same project for the same type of funding twice. And I have 2 stars to clarify this. You can request remediation funding for a project that previously received assessment funding through the BRP. That's an expected trajectory. Previous rounds, you had an assessment grant, you completed the assessment, you're going back for a remediation grant. That's totally okay. And new this year, this was kind of a side note in the guidelines, you can request additional remediation funds for a previously funded project, but you can only use your county set aside funds for that. So if you did run into some kind of cost overrun on your remediation and you need more money, you can go back and request that with your set aside funds. You just can't submit the same project for a new remediation grant or a new assessment grant that was previously funded with those tools, okay? And last, you cannot request the site demo program and BRP funds for the same project or site. So a few details on the match. 25% matching funds are required for any amount requested beyond your $1 million county set aside this year. I want you to understand that that's 25% of the total project cost, not the requested amount. And I have a sample budget in a few slides. I'll show you how that breaks out. It's a 2-year match look back. So costs incurred after July 4th, 21 are eligible for FY24 match, July 4th, 22 for FY25 match. You can also have future match costs, but those must be expended during the 2-year grant agreement term, and you're going to have to provide proof of those cost expenditures as part of your grant documentation. You cannot use previous BRP funds for match. So if you've got an assessment grant, you can't use that money as the match on your remediation grant. And anything that's eligible under the grant is eligible as match. So if you paid for phase 1 or phase 2, if you paid for infrastructure or acquisition costs, all of that is eligible as match, as well as you can estimate your future admin costs for administration of the grant as in-kind and put those in for 2 years into the future to manage the grant. These are the grant deliverables that ODOD is looking for each type of grant. Again, the call your environmental consultant icon is up in the corner. This is so you have heard of these terms and hopefully you know a little bit more about them after today. The assessment grant, they're looking for the phase 1 or phase 2, whatever you asked for funding to complete. If you had an asbestos survey performed under the grant, or if you had to do Buster Tier 1 or Tier 2 for tank removal, RCRA assessment, any other applicable documentation, anything that you're, even if you're satisfying other regulatory programs, you're giving ODOD that documentation as part of the assessment grant. Under remediation, they're looking for a voluntary action program, no further action letter, and covenant not to sue. Both of those would be issued by your certified professional for the property. As of right now, I'll point out that that's more of an expectation than a requirement from ODOD. And they'd also ask for the updated phase 2 with confirmation sample results, asbestos compliance forms if you did asbestos abatement, or other documentation. This could include if you had those in-kind match funds for management and administration of the grant. Okay, so preparing a BRP application takes time and preparation. I've included screenshots of the application tabs here for your reference and information. The FY24 funding cycle is currently open as of December 5th, and this application is currently available online. I realize that the land banks may be in different stages of the application process. You may have already submitted, or you may have not even started. The next few slides are intended to help you understand the information you'll need to have available about your project and property when submitting a BRP application. So this is the FY24 application, and you can use it as a general guideline for preparing for the FY25 cycle, but the FY25 application may be slightly different. So this is the first screen you'll see. Once you create your Ohio ID and you log in, you'll select the BRP app. And then the first thing it will ask you is, are you submitting an assessment or a remediation application? Right now, the way it's set up, you'll need to pick one. The tabs across the top here are the same for both assessment and remediation application tracks. The remediation application will ask for a few more pieces of information within these tabs, and I'll point those out as we go along, but they look very similar. This tab asks for applicant information, and I've cut it off, but it'll also ask for contact information for the land bank staff and local officials. The next tab asks for project information. I've split it in two just for readability. This asks for location and parcel information. It also asks for information on current ownership or access. And so most of this is pretty formulaic. The project history tab asks for a brief summary of the property use, including what uses qualify it as a brownfield. It asks about vacant and occupied structures on the site, as well as the current conditions of those. It requests information about any anticipated property transfers, if this information is known, and it has a space to discuss project impediments, such as other regulatory drivers, site access, rail, floodplain, wetlands, or potential permitting issues. I want to zero in on this, i.e. other regulatory environmental issues. They ask about other regulatory programs that are affecting your property at 3 different places in the application. It's on 3 different tabs, and you want to make sure that this information matches in each response. Next is the project activities tab. It asks about discrepancies in the property boundary between the phase 1, phase 2, and grant application. So maybe you had a survey done of a large development area, but you're only asking for assessment of part of it, or you're only asking for funding of part of it. You know, this is where you would just explain why those things aren't matching up and what the actual property is in your grant application. This also, again, asks about areas of the property that are governed by a regulatory program other than the voluntary action program. And it lists out TSCA, RCRA, solid waste, or Buster. It's asking you for maps and figures of areas governed by those regulatory programs. That's because in the VAP, they call it carving out. If there's another regulatory program on the site that has requirements that need to be met, those supersede the VAP. So they literally carve out that area on the map or the figure as not being pursuant to the VAP until it satisfies the other regulatory requirements. So you would show the areas on the maps and figures. I want to give you a quick overview of these regulatory programs that they're asking for. The Ohio VAP is Ohio's Voluntary Cleanup Program. It's a redevelopment vehicle. During a VAP project, a certified professional, or a CP, is registered to act as an agent of the state, overseeing the environmental assessment and remediation. So when the remediation is complete and the CP is satisfied that risk to the environment and or human health has been addressed, the CP then issues a no further action letter for the property and or a covenant not to sue. You can do an NFA and not a covenant not to sue, but if you do a CNS, you have to do an NFA first. Again, ideally, the BRP would like to see both NFA and CNS for remediation projects, but not currently a requirement. If you do decide to take your project through the VAP, you will hire a certified professional to assist with your project. There are currently around 100 licensed VAP certified professionals. You want to hire an environmental consultant that has a certified professional in good standing with Ohio EPA, meaning they haven't had any no further action letters denied. And then the other programs listed here are some examples of programs that would have requirements that supersede the VAP. These are the most common. If you have these issues on your site, you'd be addressing them through the programs listed, with the remainder of the site falling under the VAP. So I hope that's clear. RCRA is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. That handles regulated hazardous waste. So if the facility was a registered hazardous waste generator, they would have kept hazardous waste in a specific area. That area is carved out and closed under RCRA. Ohio's underground storage tank program, we refer to it as BUSTER, the Bureau of Underground Storage Tank Regulations. BUSTER regulates petroleum containing underground storage tanks. Those would require action specific to BUSTER. You'd complete a tier 1, and depending on what the tier 1 found, maybe a tier 2 assessment. TSCA is the Toxic Substances Control Act. That regulates PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. Those are usually found in oil and electric transformers or manufacturing equipment. If you're doing an asbestos abatement project, the Ohio Department of Health asbestos program is going to oversee that. And last, if you had a regulated landfill on the property, that gets closed out through the Ohio EPA Division of Materials and Waste Management. If it's an unregulated landfill or dump, it is closed under VAP. So back to the application, we're almost through it. This is the project outcomes tab. I've split this into 2 separate slides. This one asks about planned acquisition, demo, remediation, and infrastructure improvements, as well as the anticipated environmental benefits of those. And here again, you'll see reiteration of the regulatory program driver for remediation in addition to the VAP. It's the 3rd time. You're matching up all of those responses as you go along. Continuing on the project outcome slide, it's asking about the project readiness to proceed, including anything that needs to take place prior to remediation, asking also for timelines and milestones. They're looking for project start and end dates. Keep in mind that the performance period for a BRP grant agreement is typically 2 years, so you want to mirror that here. It's asking about redevelopment activities. That includes if you're doing anything else to the property to prepare it for market, such as installing or upgrading infrastructure, constructing buildings, etc. You'd list that here. And last, this tab asks you to estimate the number of jobs created and retained. Okay, so next is the project budget. You're required to provide the same information for assessment or remediation applications. The columns across the top, assessment all the way over to administrative, are eligible for match. I'm showing an assessment application cost sheet here as an example. And if you're asking for $300,000, you're matching that with $100,000. So the local funds expended as the match, they spent $400,000 on a phase 1 assessment, and then they spent $90,000 acquiring the property, but they're also estimating in-kind services of $6,000 for administration of the grant, and together that adds up to 25% match. So you'll see that $100,000 match is 25% of the total project cost, not the requested amount. Okay. You can also, just to reiterate, infrastructure can be requested from ODOD less than 20% of your total request, acquisition up to 10% of your request, and they will also cover VAP and certified professional costs. There's some fees associated with the submission of the NFA and the CNS. Those would fall under the remediation category, not administration. Administration is only for administration of the grant itself. Okay, the project documentation tab lists the supporting documentation and reports you will upload as part of your application. This is the tab that will probably take you the most time to assemble and prepare. You're not required to provide all of this information for assessment applications. Obviously, you wouldn't yet have the finished phase 2 report or remediation plans, but for a remediation application, this is the full list. So all of these documents are necessary. If you don't include them with your initial application, or if you submit your initial application to get in line, expect that you will be curing these items during the 10-day cure period after you submit your application. And then this is the final page certifying that the information contained in the application is correct. You see these various buttons at the bottom. I've cut those off my previous slides just for space, but those appear at the bottom of each tab. So you can save out of your application and return to it at any time. It will be available in your application list when you first log into Ohio ID. You'll see the red back to application list tab up in the corner. And again, so the lead entity designated for your county needs to submit these applications with their user ID. Thank you for joining me today. I know it was a lot of information. Please insert any questions you have in the chat or unmute and let me know if you have anything you'd like to talk about. I know you may have questions specific to your project or your application, and I'm excited to talk about those. I can always do a follow-up discussion though to address any specific questions you may have. So take note of my contact info. And just thanks again to OLBA and for all of you for your continued interest. So let me know if you have any questions, and Sean, if anything else came in through the chat.
We didn't get anything in the chat, but thank you for the presentation. And I did